Hello everyone. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:1. What Word was John talking about? What Word did he have in mind at John 1:1? John gives us three pretty strong clues concerning what word, what logos, he has in mind. He says, in the beginning, just as we read it, John, or Genesis 1:1. And then he tells us all things are made through the Word, just as he does in Genesis chapter 1, where we read the account of God creating all things through his spoken word. And then he says the light shines in the darkness, just as we read it Genesis 1:2-3. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and then God said, let there be light. So it seems pretty clear that John is telling us that the word which he has in mind is the same word by which God created all things in Genesis. Same word. And when we go back to Genesis and have a look, we see that God created all things through his spoken word. Now, when people read John 1:1, and we all know this, everybody hones in on discussions about John 1:1c, and the Word was God. And people sort of obsessively want to talk about this part of the verse as if this is what makes or breaks the interpretation of John 1:1. I'm telling you it's not what makes or breaks the interpretation of this verse. We should not be looking there. We should be looking here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Let's look at the other end of the sentence and ask ourselves, what beginning? People generally assume that John is talking about the Genesis act of creation, or something like a time frame, so to speak, back when God was about to create all things, and then he created all things, and that's what we're reading about in John's opening words. And they do that because they see these words, in the beginning, all things made through the Word, the light shines in the darkness. And so they immediately suppose that John, when he says the words, the beginning, he's talking about the same beginning that we read about in Genesis 1:1. So let's really ask ourselves, though, what beginning John really had in mind. And a very important passage is 1 John 1:1-2. And that's because the language of this passage is very similar to the opening words of John's Gospel. And so in his letter and in his Gospel, John opens with very similar language. What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the Word of life, and the life was manifested. And we have seen and testify and proclaim to you the eternal life which was with the Father and has appeared to us. 1 John 1:1-2. So there we have the similar language. The beginning, the Word of life, the Word which was with the Father, all the same kind of stuff. But let's look at what else John has to say in his letter. At 1 John 1:1-2, what was from the beginning. But look what he says a little bit later. You have known him from the beginning. And again, the command which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. What was from the beginning, what we have heard. The command which we have had from the beginning. And again, what was from the beginning, what we have heard. Let that abide in you, which you have heard from the beginning. And at this point, this should lead us to inquire further whether John really had Genesis 1:1 in mind when he used the words beginning. And by that I mean, is that what he really meant by these words in John 1:1? Did he mean in the beginning when God was about to create all things, when he wrote the opening words to his gospel? And Jesus said, you will testify also because you have been with me from the beginning. And then it starts to get more interesting. Let's look at what Luke says in his opening words to his gospel. Luke 1:1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning. And look at Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. Everything we have looked at so far points to the beginning of the gospel that John the Baptist came preaching. And when Jesus was baptized by John, then Jesus went out in the Spirit proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word. And it gets even more interesting when you start looking into the language, the Hebrew language. The Hebrew words for good news and flesh are basically noun and verb forms of the exact same word. Exact same word. The noun form means flesh, the verb form means good news. And that immediately calls to mind the Word became flesh. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word. The Word became flesh. So we really, really need to honestly ask ourselves what beginning John had in mind when he wrote the opening words to his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. The beginning of the good news, Mark 1:1. The Word from the beginning, Luke 1:1. The beginning, the Word of life, 1 John 1:1. What we have seen from the beginning. What we have heard from the beginning. What was from the beginning. And then we start to see other things. Like these verses in John's prologue. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not apprehend the light. John 1:5. And then a little bit later, we read, the light came to the light's own, but the light's own did not receive the light. John 1:1. You see how those two are pretty much saying the same thing? And if you read through John's gospel, you'll see how Jesus was saying light has come into the darkness to the people of Israel, to whom he was preaching. And then we start to see a little more. Embedded within those two is a statement from John the Apostle about John the Baptist. Did you ever ask yourself why John the Baptist, the introduction of John the Baptist, is kind of just thrown into that first chapter of the Gospel of John? He says the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not apprehend the light. There was a man sent from God. What? Why is that there all of a sudden? Stop and really think about that. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. And then it goes on to say this: the true light which enlightens every man was coming into the world. When? When was that true light coming into the world? It certainly sounds like we're supposed to understand that as John is baptizing, and that whole event complex of John's baptism is when the true light is coming into the world. And don't be confused by those words, into the world. The New Testament talks about us being brought into the world, like when we're born. Jesus sends his disciples into the world. It doesn't mean to be sent into this globe or this planet. False prophets have gone out into the world. The true light was coming into the world. When? Through the baptism of John. That's why John came baptizing in water. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. John came to testify to the light. God is light. God the Father is light, 1 John 1:5. And John came to prepare the way for Yahweh, the God of Israel, that light. And when we start to appreciate all those facts, we start to see what John's prologue is really about, and what those opening words are really about in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The word came to the prophets, and now the word was coming to the prophet Jesus. It was prophesied of Jesus that God, Yahweh, would put his words in this prophet's mouth. And we read Jesus declaring that very thing all throughout the Gospel of John. In the beginning of the new creation, just as the Spirit was hovering over the waters, now we have John baptizing in water. And just as God said, let there be light in the darkness in Genesis, when the Spirit comes down upon Jesus, light is going to shine into the darkness of Israel. And that's why we read in John 1:12-13, whoever did receive the light was given the authority to become children of God. New creations. New creations. We really need to step back and seriously question the traditional way people have been interpreting John's prologue. It's never going to really make any sense to people because it's wrong. The beginning that John really has in mind is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, when the Spirit came down upon him and light began to shine into the darkness of this world. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Mark 1:1. The Word, which was from the beginning. What was from the beginning? The Word of life, 1 John 1:1. We start looking at all the facts, it becomes pretty clear. God bless you.